too, so I'm going to go ahead and get started, even though we are going to have some more people joining in as we go. So hello and welcome to PGTME's second annual lunchtime lecture series entitled Critical Discussions, Multi-Stakeholder Perspectives on the Ethics of Pediatric Gene Therapy Research. Today is the final day of this week-long series, and we're going to be talking about, as you see on your screen, accountability and collaboration with patient communities. My name is Alison Bateman-House. I'm a bioethicist at NYU Grossman School of Medicine, and I have the honor of co-chairing PGTME, the Pediatric Gene Therapy and Medical Ethics Work Group that is sponsoring this series. PGTME is a project of the Division of Medical Ethics at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine. You can learn more about us at our webpage. We're going to drop a link to that in the chat so you can check it out at your leisure. And you can sign up for our free quarterly newsletter to stay abreast of our work and upcoming events like this. Annually, PGTME hosts a series of multi-stakeholder discussions on current topics related to the ethics of pediatric gene therapy research. We're going to be posting captioned recordings of this week's entire series of events on YouTube. And for those of you who registered, we're going to share the link with you so that you can just get it directly. You don't have to go search it. But in the meantime, if you want to check out our talks from last year, our first annual lecture series, just go to YouTube and search PGTME. They're all posted there, and we hope you check them out. Today's event is going to feature brief introductions by our four esteemed panelists, and then it's going to be followed by a moderated discussion. We've also allowed 40 minutes for audience questions during a Q&A at the end of the event. So throughout the panel, we encourage you to drop your questions, your comments, your concerns, whatever it is you want to share in the Q&A section of the screen. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to our four panelists to introduce themselves and their work and how they interface with pediatric gene therapy research. And so Pat, without further ado, would you kindly start us off?
Yes, thank you, Alison, and thank you so much for including me in this discussion. So PPMD is an organization focused on Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Duchenne muscular dystrophy is an X-linked progressive neuromuscular disease where boys are born looking quite normal and but miss their developmental milestones, and over a period of about 20 years lose all skeletal muscle function, and certainly the heart is at risk. We've been involved in gene therapy now for about the past 5 years, actually, where gene therapy first started with 4 boys and investigator-initiated study followed by licensing by companies. We now are lucky enough to have about 5 companies that are looking at viral gene therapy in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So we've been really deeply involved in and very enthusiastic about gene therapy and its opportunity, but also about the benefits and the risks associated with it, and certainly the unknowns. So we've been really focused in on how can we logically, honestly, and transparently talk to our patients and families about gene therapy so that they can make decisions that are meaningful to them and certainly understandable about what we know and what we don't know. Back to you, Alison.
Thanks, Pat. Liza?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on your time zone. I'm Dr. Liza Johnson. I'm a PGTME trained physician working at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. And sort of in my role, running our hospitalist program, I commonly see patients with sickle cell disease in our acute care clinic. But my main hat outside of hospital administration is as a bioethicist and researcher, looking at issues in clinical and research ethics. So my scholarship is in communication and decision-making with a focus on improving informed consent and decisional support for sort of high-risk or early phase therapies. Right now, I'm co-lead of a SEER project that has brought together multidisciplinary experts in sickle cell ethics, law, and health communication to work with a 13-member family advisory council of patients or parents of children with sickle cell disease from 3 areas of the country. So Baltimore, Maryland, Memphis, Tennessee, and Seattle, to try to understand their attitudes and beliefs surrounding gene therapy and sort of how we can improve our communication as we roll out novel trials for gene therapy for adults and pediatric patients with sickle cell. And I think that's why I'm here today. So back to Alison.
Thanks, Liza. And I'm going to ask you to speak up just a little bit more next time you come on mic. Dr. Krishnamurti, please.
Hi, I'm Lakshmanan Krishnamurti. I'm a pediatric hematologist, oncologist, bone marrow transplant physician by training. And I'm currently the chief of the section of pediatric hematology, oncology, BMT at Yale University School of Medicine. And my interaction with gene therapy is a result of my multiple points of contact in clinical translational research in sickle cell disease. So prior to coming, so at Yale, my interest is in working with investigators that are trying to do gene therapy without chemotherapy and intrauterine gene therapy, which is really the sort of a next frontier, and also bringing in clinical trials for gene therapy. Before this, I was in Atlanta heading a very large BMT program and did a lot of transplants for sickle cell disease. And so a lot of issues in gene therapy overlap with that in transplant. And I lead a NIH-funded multi-center clinical trial, and also very involved in decision-making about gene therapy and qualitative studies. I work with multiple gene therapy companies in multiple capacities, as a participant in a clinical trial, being on an advisory board, steering committee, looking at patient-reported outcomes. Before that, for 13 years, I ran a hematology section in Pittsburgh. And so I've been in the trenches taking care of patients with sickle cell disease. And really what drove me to all of this is that I trained in India, where you may be surprised to know 25% of the children, newborns with sickle cell, are born each year. So you think about Africa, but really 25% come from one country, India, which is not somewhat a big country. And I'm still very involved in issues related to cost effectiveness. How is this going to be translated into out there beyond the United States where most of the patients live? And so there's so many different aspects to it. And really pleased to be here with this August company. Thank you.
And we're really pleased to have you here. And last, but certainly not least, Dr. Reyna.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here and an honor to be presenting today and speaking about what I love the most, right? It's passion about our patients and our patient communities. And so my name is Sandra Reyna, and my training is in neurology. I worked pretty much my whole medical career focused on rare diseases. And so before joining industry, my academic life really involved in working very, very closely with rare disorders. And one of the rare disorders that my really, in the last 15 years, I've been very much focused and honed in on is understanding the disease such as spinal muscular atrophy to the point where natural history understanding of this disease is critical in order to understand better outcomes and to understand efficacy of any possible therapy. It's always great to have that base and understanding of how this disease works and how it progresses, right? So we can best align with study designs. And so I was very fortunate to spend most of my medical career in academia learning with families and through families what the natural history disease pattern looks like, so that then we can project and anticipate if, when, and if ever we would have a therapy for a rare disease, what expectations are really there for families. And so my work was very much focused on working very closely with clinical trials, designing clinical trials, directing the clinical trial research program at the University of Utah Primary Children's. And there, we had the we were very fortunate to have very high level team of colleagues who understood the need of establishing databases and who understood how critical it was to maintain that connection with families so that we can anticipate again what their needs could be at the time that they could be part of a trial, right? And understand from the bottom up. And of course, understand how critical all families are to anything that we do in science, right? And so my work lately now, I'm representing Novartis Gene Therapies. I joined the industry in 2015, so I haven't been in industry for too long. My heart is still very much of who I am, which is a clinician, and of course, I'm a researcher as well, and I'm very proud to understand that bringing science to families in a way that it's understandable to them is really our job, right? And that's where my role right now is within Novartis Gene Therapies, is as a vice president of global medical affairs and therapeutic area head. I take it very seriously to really comply with everything that we can when it comes to understanding science and putting it in a way that our families are able to capture exactly what this means for them, right? Every single family is unique. Every single family brings different stories to the table, and therefore it's our job to also support them in that perspective. So thank you for having me here today, and I hope I can bring further understanding of some of the work that we are doing right now in Novartis Gene Therapies when it comes to treating patients with rare diseases.
Thank you, Sandy, and thanks to all of our panelists for making time out of your super busy schedules to join us here today for what I hope is going to be a really interesting and wide-ranging conversation, and I'm interested to see what questions we get from the audience. So throughout this week's series, we've been highlighting multi-stakeholder perspectives on the ethics of pediatric gene therapy research, clinical trials. And we've been hearing from patients. We actually had yesterday someone who participated as a child in a gene therapy study. We've been hearing from their parents. We've been hearing from clinicians. We've been hearing from members of industry. We've really taken a very inclusive approach to trying to hear what people are concerned about, what questions they have, and what sort of ethical issues they see as being, both present and sort of future looming. We've acknowledged that there's uncertainty, throughout gene therapy research. We've acknowledged that hope is central to these trials and the conduct of these trials and the participation decisions made by patients and their families. We've talked about what responsibilities rest on clinical trial sponsors, research, patient advocacy groups, and all the other stakeholders involved in gene therapy trials in children, and talking about, what is it that we all need to do to make sure these trials proceed as ethically as possible. And so today we're going to turn that on its head a little bit and say, what responsibilities do all these stakeholder groups have to people who are not the ones in the trials, but who are members of those patient communities? They cannot get into the trial. Perhaps they live too far away from the trial site. Perhaps they have comorbid conditions that make them ineligible to participate. Just for some reason, their parents don't have time to take them to the trial. Or as Dr. Krishnamurti just, indicated, they live in a country where gene therapy research is not actively occurring at this moment. So what we want to talk about are these patients who either exist right now, but cannot participate or choose not to participate in this research, or even future patients who will hopefully be benefited by this research, but we're not thinking about them right now. When an IRB reviews a protocol, they're not saying, what do we need to do to think about these other people who are not participating in the trial, but at the same time, we do have an ethical obligation to benefit all patients, not just trial populations. So this is what we're talking about today. So I'm really interested to hear what our panelists think about this. And I'm really interested, as I said, to hear from the audience what you think about this topic, which I really don't think it's nearly enough play. We talk a lot about, how do you do informed consent right? How do you structure trial communications? But I think we also need to be thinking about those people who are not in trials. What do we owe to them, and how do we set up structures and policies that make those feasible? So in preliminary conversations with our panelists about this topic, one of the first things that was entered into the conversation was the issue of data. And so I want to start with Pat. You're the panelist most directly related to a patient community. What are your thoughts about what could be done with data from a trial to ensure that all patients with that condition, all children with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, benefit from this research, not just those who are within the trial? Oh, and you're muted.
Yep, so sorry. Well, first of all, data that is siloed is not useful, right? In terms of other than for the person that's siloing the data, I suppose. I think we can learn so much if the experience of the safety events, the SAEs and the SUSARs would be shared. so that we can understand and be fully informed for these patients to participate. Because what we hear often as patients in the community, we hear that there was a serious adverse event, but we don't really hear any particulars. And for instance, or for example, when we hear of this, we usually hear very peripheral information, right? There was an SAE, the patient was hospitalized, the patient went home. So patients and families are sort of in this perspective of, oh, well, it was just meant 2 more weeks in the hospital and everything's fine, right? So I think the data should be shared to the extent that you can make a better decision or a more well-informed decision. And so that I think that it's important to understand is the term gene therapy suggests and makes an assumption that there is a therapy in clinical trials. That's one of the difficulties of language, right, that we see for these families, that it's a gene therapy, so therefore there's some therapeutic gain, which we're assuming, and depending on what hope looks like for you that day, could be a significant gain toward cure. The SAEs that occur, right, I recognize the proprietary information, I recognize the need for privacy, but at the same time, a full explanation of what is occurring, sharing the data across companies so that we are all learning. These are very early days of gene therapy. And I think to the extent that we can learn from sharing these data is going to, first of all, establish trust within the community, allow us to do and conduct better trials. Perhaps as we see in Duchenne, we're seeing certain mutations are being eliminated based on serious adverse events or SUSARs that have occurred. So I think the more we can share the data across and learn from it, so that patients can trust us, so that we can be better at informing them and help them with their decisions. And another example in Duchenne is that the current recruitment age group is 4 to 7-year-olds. These are people who've just gotten a diagnosis and trying to wrap their head around this. I think that informing them in a much more transparent way, taking time with them and explaining what we're talking about, even in what we know, what we don't know, what we're hoping to learn, and how these companies are willing to share data would be extremely powerful for the community. And I think essential for all of us to learn together and to learn across in SMA as well. You're in Zolgensma, right? For us to understand what's going on there, how can we apply that? How can we learn from it so that we all learn together going forward?
I want to invite our panelists who have any thoughts on this issue to unmute at some point and jump in. Let me just do one quick follow-up to Pat, and then I'll come to you, Dr. Krishnamurti. Pat, I think I just heard you say the majority of trials in Duchenne are targeting children ages 4 to 7. And so that means, ipso facto, if you're older than 7, you're not going to be directly benefited by these trials. So do you have thoughts on what needs to be happening in this trial development landscape to make sure we're taking care of those older patients, to make sure that they benefit from this knowledge?
First of all, Alison, it is heartbreaking for a 4 to 7-year-old. Basically, the cutoff is the day before your 8th birthday. You can imagine if there's a delay in the study or anything that makes you cross that line, how that must feel. It feels for patients like they've gotten the diagnosis all over again, right? From the perspective of, and from our learnings from the pandemic, if I could run the world, we would have a master protocol. We would be able to look across these ages and stages, because sometimes I worry that at the end of the day, not that these 4 to 7 shouldn't be in these clinical trials, but if you're 3 or below, or if you're 8 years old and above, or if you've lost ambulation, that it's time, right? Time against the progression of the disease. And the longer we say, will be approved in, or will hope to be improved if the data looks good in 4 or 5 years against the progression of Duchenne, you will have lost significant function. And you might not even be here. So we have to think about, and I again will reiterate, we've learned from the pandemic's experience that master protocols are reasonable to utilize in this regard, and that they are inclusive with subset analysis and could get us there. I recognize the investment that it would take. I recognize that there are lots of challenges here, but I think we have to look at these patients and know that time is against them. So the longer they wait, and maybe that's making an assumption there will confer benefit, and this gets back to a benefit risk discussion, but I think that including ages and stages in these diseases is an ethical imperative for people waiting and losing function.
So Pat, for anyone listening who's not familiar with the master protocol, I think what I would paraphrase you as just saying in one sentence or less is that we need to be more inclusive in who's participating in these trials and figure out, can we do more than just do research on ages 4 to 7? Can we include people who perhaps do have comorbidities or other things and still be able to get useful knowledge, but it's knowledge that would help a wider array of patients? Is that basically what you are saying?
That's basically it, and hopefully give us labels that are broad at the end of the day.
I saw Dr. Krishnamurti wanted to get in, and then Dr. Johnson, so please go ahead.
Yeah, so I agree about the need to share data. So I'm actually pleased to say that when 2 patients developed myelodysplastic syndrome and leukemia following gene therapy for sickle cell disease, these data were presented really in a very transparent manner to the public at large. So I think that that was very, very good. I think that the issues that we may pay attention to is sharing data just beyond the severe SUSARs. It's the first data we're not capturing. For instance, we're not capturing data about what is the patient experience? How do they make a decision? How did it make a change in their lives? So we're beginning to do this after the fact, but really I think going forward, we ought to be capturing this data. Second, response to a SUSAR. So there were some mitigation strategies put forth after, these SUSARs with the myeloid leukemia, but these were sort of generally available because they were the same set of investigators, but they're not necessarily even shared or taken up by other sponsors. So I think we ought to really, think about how we're capturing data. And then beyond this, there is, cost effectiveness and all of this. This ought to be captured prospectively, not by people going back and doing chart reviews and things. And I want to share just one thing is we had I was heartbroken. We had a patient who had metachromatic leukodystrophy. This is a healthy child who rapidly had neurodegeneration. And then we were able to take the younger sibling who had no symptoms and then send them to Milan for gene therapy. And they did a fabulous job, paid for the whole family to be there and, during philanthropy. But they had nothing for this child. And the family would ask me every single time, but what about Johnny? He's the one that we showed up for. So really, these are important things to think about. So I agree with what you just said, Dr. Furlong.
Before we go on, I just want to note that both you and Pat use the abbreviation SUSAR. So for someone who's not familiar with that, can you just define what that is, please?
Pat?
Sure. A SUSAR is a sudden unexpected event, something that was not anticipated. So it's called a SUSAR, and apologize for all the acronyms.
No worries. We've got one of our colleagues in the chat trying to define things in real time, but I just thought it'd be helpful to say it up front. Dr. Johnson, I saw you wanted to get in, and then Dr.
Yeah.
Reyna, coming to you because I don't want to leave you out of this conversation.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a follow-up point about the sharing of information. I think that, and I think Kara in the chat posted about the press release from Bluebird Bio, but sort of, where there is a vacuum of knowledge, sort of rumors and sort of uncertainty can spread. And so, to pull up a quote from our focus group, one of the adult patients said, "This thing with Bluebird, they stopped it because of patients getting cancer. Is that something new that you guys have just learned about, or have you always known that could cause cancer?" And so we've also started to ask them, but haven't coded yet, do you care about the adverse events for gene therapy for other diseases that are not sickle cell? And they're like, yes, we want to sort of know what's going on and what the explanations are. And some of that may be related to historical mistrust and sort of feeling that, people are not being honest and transparent about all of the risks and what is known about the risks. So I just wanted to echo that I think it's important that we think about how we communicate because social media and Facebook groups are active. And we just saw with the COVID-19 vaccine, how misinformation can sort of erode trust and erode interest in sort of a novel therapy.
Absolutely. And I just want to, pull the point out further that we're worried about mistrust and misunderstanding, not only among potential or current trial participants, but among a community, as a whole. Dr. Reyna, I want to pull you in. What are your thoughts about this
Yes,
conversation?
absolutely. This is a wonderful leeway. I think what our two esteemed panelists just shared is really what I'm going to emphasize on. So let me just say that I can speak to what Novartis Gene Therapies has started to do, and it was really poised to do this from the very beginning, right? So what we fully understand is that families who participate in or enroll their child in a clinical trial are really the backbone of everything that we do. They deserve the highest level of recognition and respect for their efforts to help advance science. And we truly believe on that. And we work on that theory. So we understand that without them, and the sacrifices that they make, data to support and enhance our understanding of a therapy would not exist. Right. So the safety of our patients, and I heard this over and over again through our panelists just now, is really our primary concern. And any decision or decisions related to our clinical trials are done so with this in mind, and in collaboration, of course, with health authorities, ethics committees, and institutional review boards. Additionally, I'm going to take a few minutes of this because I think it's critical for us to see where we are right now with Novartis Gene Therapies. Additionally, we are committed to the ongoing monitoring of adverse events as it relates to the use of our one-time gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy. As with all commercially, marketed products, we are continuously monitoring, the safety of our therapy and sharing safety data as part of the required pharmacovigilance with global health authorities. We then ensure, that there's a comprehensive communication to all stakeholders, such as healthcare providers, trial investigators, the patient community, and health authorities. And so what we've done is we understood very quickly as we were, setting ourselves up for these gene therapy trials, is that we needed to really create and initiate a registry. And so what we've done so far is that we have our long-term follow-up studies, in addition to a real-world evidence data being captured through a registry, and it's called the Restore Registry. And here we will monitor the safety in patients treated with Zolgensma for up to 15 years post-treatment as aligned with the FDA. And I want to elaborate a little more on this because I think it's important for our panelists to be part of this with me, and also for our audience right now, is that the Restore Registry is an ongoing and it's a prospective multi-center, multinational observational study of patients with a diagnosis of SMA. And this is including patients from managed access programs, from partnering clinical sites with a planned follow-up of 15 years. The Restore Registry provides real-world data for enhancing our understanding of patients with SMA cared in a routine practice. We have so far more than 300 patients enrolled in this registry to date. As part of the Muscular Dystrophy Association meeting in 2021, we reported an interim data from this Restore registry. And here we were able to capture what our community, especially the SMA population, what they want to know about what's been captured so far in real world evidence. And we were able to report that older children, older in this setup for us for SMA, means older than 6 months of age, right, have achieved a clinically meaningful benefit when treated with our gene therapy alone. And after switching to a gene therapy or in combination with another SMA therapy, of course, with safety events consistent with a previously described safety profile. Nearly all children who were screened and tested with a motor function scale were able to show that they gained motor function and maintained the score that they were best tested at in baseline. So children were identified, those who were identified via newborn screening and were enrolled in this registry in Restore. And we were able to capture through this data that they needed less, they were most likely, less likely to receive more than one SMA therapy compared to those who were diagnosed clinically, meaning later than pre-birth, than post-birth. So, we have also worked very, very closely to see how we can show what the achievements of Zolgensma has been. And so far, Zolgensma has led, to the point where we capture that these children are maintaining and gaining new milestones, even years after they've been treated. So far, we have 2 long-term follow-up studies within our program. One is for the phase 3 studies, and the other is for the very initial study for gene therapy. And through these studies and registries, what we can see is that all patients who are alive in long-term follow-up does not really show any evidence of new or delayed safety signals supporting a favorable benefit-risk profile. So what I really believe here is that we also have the responsibility to share the data in a way that is understandable and digestible, so families can clearly conceptualize what it may mean for their family and others in the community. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to really elaborate on this, because I think it's very important for our audience to see where we have been from the very beginning with Novartis gene therapies when it comes to safety and clinical trial design.
I want to press on something you said just to make sure that I understood it and our audience understood it. So I'm not an ethicist. I'm an ethicist. I'm not an SMA specialist. I'm just sitting here trying to remember. I think Zolgensma was approved for type 1 SMA, but I've certainly heard of it being used in type 2 or type 3 SMA. So are these, I guess they're considered off-label uses, are they being captured in this registry as well, or is the registry solely for the on-label use?
Yeah. All right. So you ask a very good question, and so let me just emphasize a little bit on what you just said. Right. So the label.
And correct
absolutely.
anything I said wrong, because like I said, I'm not a specialist in this.
You didn't say anything wrong. What I think is just a clarification on what is really SMA, and how do we know what is it? What is a type 1, right? So just starting from that point. So SMA is it's a neurodegenerative disease, right? It affects the motor neurons. It loses motor neurons very quickly, even after the first day of birth, right? We know that it can also happen. It starts happening prenatally. Right. So once this baby is diagnosed, it can literally be a few months after birth that they get diagnosed due to symptoms. Right. So now you have clinical symptomatic babies versus newborn screen babies who we capture literally a few days after birth. And so what our label states is that it's going to be treating patients who are younger than 6 months of age, who have a certain weight as well. Right, because of the vector load for gene therapy. But it also captures the fact that it has the SMN1 gene is the reason why we have patients with SMA. It's mutated, it's non-existent, right? But because they have a backup gene, such as the SMN2 gene, a survival motor neuron gene 2, this is the reason why these children are still alive, because they're able to produce the SMN protein that's needed. And therefore, what we've learned through all these years of understanding what SMA is that the number of backup genes for these children or for that child is significant, and it has been correlated with how severely affected they could be. And so if they have a type 1 baby, most likely has 2 copies of the SMN2 gene. And so therefore it tells me that there's a high likelihood that this baby is going to be very weak and it's going to be a floppy baby. And so when we say that we are capturing in this registry all patients who are treated with Zolgensma and any other disease-modifying treatment for SMA, we are capturing patients who have more than 2 copies of the SMN2 gene, such as 3-copy babies, which most likely will indicate that these babies could sit, right? Or some of them could also stand and walk. And so the label is not that this is being off-label. I think the label itself, it says up to 2 or 3 copies, which then it could cover for patients who are non-sitters, type 1, who are sitters, type 2, and possibly even walkers who are type 3s, because walkers also have 3 copies of the SMN2 gene. And so, it's a broad, in a way, spectrum, but it really is up to the treating physician to decide if this is the appropriate medication or treatment for their patient.
Got it. That was very helpful. I definitely learned something there, so I appreciate it. Before I let you step off the center platform, I just want to ask you one more question, because Novartis is in a very unique, not unique, but rare situation in that it actually does have an approved gene therapy product out there. And I'm an ethicist, and I think a lot about equity and access, and as Dr. Krishnamurti said earlier, who is going to actually get this product as compared to who needs it. And so I was just wondering, have there been conversations either within Novartis or outside of Novartis, but with the patient community or others, about what is needed in terms of the infrastructure that needs to be there to, as you said, identify these children early on, whether it's newborn screening, whether it's early pediatric assessment, et cetera. What needs to happen in order to make sure this product is as widely available as possible? Have you had conversations about that? And do you have thoughts about sort of the stakeholder communities that we're talking about and their role to play in these sort of basic infrastructure building needs to make sure these really amazing products are utilizable as much as possible?
Absolutely. Again, an amazing question. And it really addresses what I said earlier, right? Babies being identified early in life, versus those babies who are identified later, literally weeks after life, and now they're symptomatic. So when we think about SMA, we often say that SMA is almost a ticking bomb, because it's time for these children is neurons. So any day that passes for these children to not receive any kind of treatment, including standard of care, it is absolutely detrimental to their health. So as I explained earlier, what causes SMA, right? We know it's a deletion of that SMN1 gene or the survival motor neuron gene. And the resulting process of this is that it produces a progressive and irreversible loss of motor neurons, which really affects the muscle function, right, including breathing and swallowing, and just basic body movements of these children. So SMA, we know that it progresses so quickly that, again, identifying these patients early is absolutely critical. So what this means is that newborn screening plays a huge role in identifying these babies early. And we have several campaigns right now, both in the U.S. And out of the U.S. to ensure that early signs and symptoms of SMA are recognized by clinicians, including pediatricians and other non-neurologists. Right. We also are ensuring that institutional readiness is implemented, and have set up preceptorship programs for education on SMA and gene therapy. But there are other systems in place that can help ensure that prompt diagnosis after birth, like newborn screening, is placed. So every state has a routine newborn screening panel, and this is performed in days after birth, right? That identifies conditions that can affect the child's long-term health or survival, and it only requires a few drops of blood from their heel, right? So a heel stick, and despite a federally recommended uniform panel of diseases for all states to follow, only 38 states to date are testing for SMA. That leaves babies in 12 states, plus Washington, D.C., believe it or not, unscreened. So we feel strongly that it's imperative that all 50 states and more countries around the world screen for SMA, but we recognize that there are barriers to overcome in certain areas. Rather than one group or individuals leading the charge, it's really a collaborative effort, right, between the states, patient advocacy organizations, and industry sponsors like Novartis, who can really come together to break barriers and advance screening further for SMA specifically.
Thanks for letting me ask you that. Dr. Krishnamurti, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this idea of what is needed to, not only on a domestic level, but globally to create infrastructure in order to make sure that these amazing products, once approved, can be widely used. Do you have thoughts on that? Yeah, and you're muted, sorry.
So if we start looking at it from the cost and infrastructure, right? So cost for an allogeneic transplant in the U.S. is $400,000 to $600,000. cost in India is $17,000, or from a mad sibling donor transplant. So you can imagine $17,000 is a lot of money in India. So the cost of a gene therapy is close to $2 million. So knocking off several zeros off this figure is a simple answer. So we'd have to reduce costs. So the response to that is saying, well, you're going to get, going to ER, going to a hospital, getting, all these medicines for all these years. So compared to the lifetime cost of having a disease, to this cost of one-time big cost. So it's like saying, well, you can buy this Tesla now, or, and then you compare it to your monthly payments, and we'll put you on a payment plan. Well, first of all, that payment plan for a Tesla, I can't afford, leave alone people in India. So I think we're sort of just not in the ballpark for costs. And there's no, even though we might call, we can do cost effectiveness, which is legitimate science, the total cost is what I would look at when buying that car, rather than how do I spread out the cost. Second is creating the infrastructure. Allogeneic transplant is harder to create infrastructure for. You know what, autologous transplant, we could do that in Africa with a little bit of effort. So we'd have to create these infrastructures for where we can actually deliver it. For your drug, for the SMA patients, the only place we could give it in our hospital in Atlanta was in the Pediatric Hematology Oncology Clinic, because we knew how to handle these cell therapy products. So even if you had it and it just comes in a box and open the label and give IV, you have to have infrastructure for that. So I think those are all some of the considerations we must have.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sort of infrastructure that I'm thinking about. You have to have a pharmacy that knows how to handle these products. You have to have trained personnel. I don't remember if it was you or Dr. Reyna who said it, but the key point about, I think it was Dr. Reyna, you have to actually train pediatricians to diagnose these diseases, not just neuromuscular specialists, because, not everyone's going to get there or get there fast. So those are the sort of questions that are rattling around in my mind in terms of, whether it's sponsors, whether it's legislatures, whether it's patient advocacy groups. Are there things that, are low-hanging fruit that we really ought to be grabbing now and saying, in order to make these things of the most value add possible to a patient group outside of just that small trial population, these are things we really need to be honing in on.
I just want to complete that. To get that patient to get that SMA, treatment in Georgia required somebody who could advocate with the legislature. Because, I mean, just think of the $2.8 million cost that the hospital doesn't want to be left with if, Medicaid won't pick up. So these are big issues in the US. If I start doing gene therapy for all the patients in Georgia or Connecticut, I'd have to have a conversation with the Medicaid folks in Connecticut or Georgia.
Dr. Johnson, I see you want to get in, and I was headed to you right now anyway, so please, the floor is yours.
I was just going to jump in. We had a meeting a few weeks ago with some stakeholders at St. Jude, and I don't know that we know where to go next, but I think at some governmental level, there needs to be some roundtable organized, maybe through the National Academy or somewhere else, where we bring patient advocacy groups, we bring Medicare and Medicaid, because if gene therapy is successful, we're going to have a lot of patients, and how are we not going to also bankrupt the healthcare system? If you think about sickle cell disease, right, it's a tremendous expense to the healthcare system over, from birth to death for an individual who lives into adulthood with sickle cell disease. And then never mind the lost wages and economic productivity from missed work and missed school. But Bluebird Bio pulled out of the European market to some extent after they couldn't agree on sort of a price reimbursement for their gene therapy product. So I think it's better to sort of get everyone at the table now and start thinking about how we're going to cover this if it's successful, because it could benefit so many patients. They may have individual rare diseases, but together it's a large group of people whose lives and families are affected.
Yeah, great point. And while I have you, I just want to say, so both you and Dr. Krishnamurti, specialize in sickle cell. I know sickle cell, it's a comparatively simple biological, genetic disorder. We've known about it for a long time. We still don't have a cure, let alone great, treatments for everybody. And there certainly are ongoing efforts right now to pursue a gene therapy. Just given, the sort of long anticipated progress towards a cure or a really effective treatment in this disorder, what do you think stakeholders need to be doing right now to say, yes, a small number of people are in trials and maybe they will benefit from them, but looking towards the future, when we're looking at the patient population as a whole and trying to make sure we benefit them all, what is it you think we should be prioritizing right now?
That's a great question. I think I'll take a step backwards in order to go forward. Bone marrow transplant for sickle cell disease has been available since 1984, and something like 2,000 patients have had a transplant. Dr. Krishnamurti may have the more updated data. And to date, a lot of that has been, very few have had a matched sibling donor. And, now there's experimental trials with haploidentical transplantation and different conditioning regimens for matched unrelated donors. So I think it's an exciting time for sickle cell disease because we are trying to refine bone marrow transplant. We're trying to see if gene therapy can be successful. There are new sort of disease modifying agents. So when a patient with sickle cell disease comes into a clinician's office or meets with a patient advocate, I think to move forward with gene therapy, we need to sort of think about what individual patients need and value and see what is best for them at the time. Unlike, the neurological disorders or refractory leukemia, you don't need your gene therapy for sickle cell disease next week. And so when we meet with patients, I think from the medical side, we desire people to sort of have this potentially curative therapy before they develop significant morbidity or have a stroke. But patients have complex lives with spouses, children, parents, jobs. FMLA may cover your job, but it doesn't cover your income. So it's a complicated decision. And when we have talked with patients and families about gene therapy in our focus group, they really had concerns, about the sort of risks and complications of therapy itself. So hair loss, future infertility, and the biggest thing for them are the unknown future risks. And this was expressed sort of most greatly by the parents. Am I going to put my child through potentially, early phase trial and give them more, open Pandora's box, and they will have more problems down the road than we can anticipate. So it is my sense that, we have a needs assessment, and part of it will present at ASH next week. Only 4.8% of patients feel extremely knowledgeable about gene therapy, and 2/3 say they have no or incomplete knowledge. So I think there's a lot of room for education. And so I think moving forward with trials, going slow will be fast. And we need to figure out a way to communicate honestly and transparently in a way that says, these are all the new things for sickle cell. Let me help you. Let me use these tools to help you decide what is best for you right now. And they may decide gene therapy is not best for me today, but it might be best for me 6 months from now. There's been some discussion about sort of, you're weighing your quality of life and the impact of sickle cell disease against a novel clinical trial with unknown future risks. And I think that weighs heavily on participants. And I think we have to remember that trust is hard to rebuild. So we need to be careful about our messaging. I think people definitely remember that, gene therapy, might give you HIV after they heard the 60 Minutes piece. And we sort of have spent a lot of time kind of explaining that you don't have HIV. It's just sort of a sequelae of the test for that method of gene therapy. And then I think we need to look at ways to sort of support families and wraparound services so that while they're undergoing the treatment, if they're in their early 20s, that their lives are supported as well. So that's kind of a roundabout answer to your question.
No, but it's very useful, and I
Mm-hmm.
like that, phraseology of go slow to go fast, right? Sometimes you just have to work incrementally and build up slowly in order to get to where you want to go as quickly as possible.
Can I make a really quick point?
Yes, go ahead.
So I think I really like what you just said, Lisa, about cost versus value. I mean, I'm not looking, if I'm going to really want to look good in a luxury car, I'm not looking at cost because I value, what it makes me look like. So if you look at the top few drugs that cost Medicaid, none of them actually do fundamental change to the patient's life like gene therapy. And there are models about how much, if we offer gene therapy to everybody who's eligible, how much it would add per member. And it's not that different. So I think that we actually as a society have to decide. And also, we might make different decisions for people who are underprivileged. We may not attach the same cost value calculation for heart disease as we might do for sickle cell disease.
I want to note that we're getting near the time where we're going to switch over to audience Q&A. I see we've got 2 queues in already. Go ahead and start posting things that you want us to post to the panelists. And in the meantime, I want to go back to Pat for a minute. And so, Pat Furlong, I know your organization, Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, has a lot of experience with patients and their adult caregivers traveling from one location to another to participate in these clinical trials. And sometimes that means, from one city to another, sometimes that means from one country to another. And just, to say the obvious, not every patient or family can do that. So I want to ask you, with regard to really, again, trying to benefit those patients who are not in clinical trials, perhaps just because logistically they can't be or financially they can't be, what is it that you think stakeholders need to be doing to make sure that those who are not in the trials are still going to benefit from the research that's happening?
Yeah, thanks, Alison. I think this is a huge issue, and for patients and families who aren't able to travel for whatever reason, whether it's money, resources, caregivers, just life itself gets in the way. We're especially worried, or especially if they had experience with people moving from one country to the other. And for instance, or for example, in the United States, there are people coming in from South America in order to participate in these trials. Because in South America, at least currently, they don't ever foresee that even if we see an approval, that they will ever have access, just because of the political situation, the insurance coverage, the reimbursement. They'll just be outside looking in. And except that when they come to this country, or where anyone comes to the United States, they're on a visa to stay, right? But there is no visa, for instance, for participation in clinical trials. So the investigators don't want to include them because they're worried that once the infusion takes place, they'll go back to their country and they won't have the follow-on data, which makes sense because they're probably not able politically to stay here because the visa is education visa, work visa, or a very short-term visa. So I mean, if we could write policies about the participation in a clinical trial from outside the country that enables these people to be well supported while they're here and to stay here without having to worry every other day that they'll be unable to stay in this country. I think that's one thing. I agree with Lisa, they need support for their lives. We need to figure that out. We are also worried, just to go back a step, on if gene therapy is approved in Duchenne muscular dystrophy or in the muscular dystrophies, that the payers such as Medicaid will not approve other therapies that may be needed along the way, or other equipment that may be needed along the way. So I think that this is a huge issue about how we support patients. And I also worry about patients in rural areas. If there are concerns about referring patients in these rural areas into a clinical trial just because the investigator believes that there's a bias that they can't participate, that they won't be able to, or will be unwilling to follow up. So I think there's a lot of challenges that have to be addressed so that we can at least offer the opportunity to participate in clinical trials to a wide range of people and support them so that they are able. And also to understand the issues of, there are no therapies, there are 4 approved therapies in Duchenne for a very certain subset of the population that are amenable to antisense, to exon skipping, but there but these patients have no other opportunity. So I think it is really upon us to figure out how can we encourage people, how can we educate them so that they understand what we're talking about, what the opportunity is, what the risks and burdens are that are known, what the uncertainties are or the unknowns are, and offer them support to participate in a trial. And for those coming from countries where there will never be access to a gene therapy, we have to support them in some way to be able to include them in trials or provide a way for access. It is impossible and heartbreaking to have a child with a catastrophic illness with no options in your country and then a wall for you to participate in any other country for geography,
Absolutely.
for finances, for whatever.
Yeah. If I may, could I add
Yes,
to
go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, I want to say I totally agree. You know, gene therapy can definitely be challenging, and in dealing with rare diseases, right? It's absolutely horrendous for the families who are going through that challenge in their lives. But when it comes to gene therapy, at least from our experience and from my own experience for SMA, I can say that, you know, when it comes to value, and that's one point I want to make first, is the value, right, of Novartis gene therapies, is the quality of life change that these children have already seen and the transformation that this therapy has already given them. So when we think about, this is what I was stressing earlier, when we think about the natural history of the disease and what the life of these children could have been without, you know, now the option of you know, having a disease modifying therapy, and one of them being gene therapy, is absolutely night and day. So I can tell you that the value when it comes to that is absolutely, it has no price tag on it, because it's a difference between, especially the type 1 babies who are the very weak babies. It's a difference between being flat on their bed all day and very floppy with respiratory issues, digestive issues, you know, nutritional issues. They can't eat, they can't speak, they have breathing problems, and doing that day in, day out, versus a patient who now with the same phenotype, the same SMN gene copy number, now can sit and most likely also eating on their own and speaking. Maybe they can't stand and maybe they can't walk, but now they have a whole different quality of life by becoming a sitter, right? A type 2. And what if they really react, you know, and respond differently, and now they become a walker? So you see the quality of life of these children is really quite different. So the transformative effect of gene therapy for the SMA community has been incredibly impressive with the study results that we've seen so far to date in our clinical trials and in the real world evidence data. But I want to address your point, Pat, that you just made about access to patients and worldwide. So what we know is that for many rare diseases, right, including SMA, time is of an essence, and we understand that very clearly at Novartis Gene Therapies. You know, there's an urgent need to treat these diseases, demand solutions to enable access, right? And so what we have done at Novartis Gene Therapies is that we are fully committed to ensuring that all children around the world who may benefit from our gene therapy has access. So one of the ways that we did this, it was through our global managed access program, which we launched right at the end of 2019, and this was really soon after Zolgensma was approved. And so the global managed access program makes Zolgensma available to eligible patients with spinal muscular atrophy who are under the age of 2, and including where Zolgensma has not received regulatory approval. And at the start of 2021, what we did is we responded to the feedback from the SMA community, and we refocused the global managed access program on patients with the greatest need, right, for whom no other treatment options were available. So this program benefits patients and families who otherwise would not have access to our gene therapy or other SMA treatments. In particular point of which we are really proud of having this available for families. And I'm also very proud to be part of this organization who's doing that for the families. And so to date, I can tell you that approximately 250 patients or babies in nearly every continent have been able to receive Zolgensma through this program. It's a significant percentage of the total number of more than 1,600 patients who now have been received, Zolgensma as part of their treatment. And definitely, Zolgensma Global MAP Access Program has been a successful program as a direct result really of the collaboration and insights from the global SMA community. We are very proud that Zolgensma is now approved in more than 40 countries around the world. And we are constantly working to find solutions for access to our innovative treatment for patients who can benefit from it. We continue to actively advance regulatory efforts globally to increase access to Zolgensma. So I just wanted to really share those thoughts with you because I think it's critical that we share this with the community so they really can work closely with us. And we are very, very connected with the families' needs, with the families' inquiries, and also with patient advocate groups who every time we think of a possibility of a trial, which we have now, come up with new trials that include older children, that include children with different weight. We took that trial design and really sat down very closely across the globe with patient advocate groups to see about what their thoughts were. Is this design acceptable to you? What do you think the challenges are going to be? What are we going to need as a company to make sure that these patients are recruited? And if they are recruited, what do they need to stay within the study if they have needs that are particular to that family, right? So we are working very closely with all patient advocate groups that we can get feedback from. And that's how we have really taken the feedback and designed our trials for much broader patient population.
No, your model is incredible. It really is a wonderful model. I think, and in terms of value, when we see the results of Zolgensma in these infants, it is quite incredible. In other gene therapies, such as Duchenne, depending on when you treat, again, you were hoping for durability of a number of years, but we don't foresee that this is going, because this is obviously a single gene disorder, but as it doesn't get into the satellite cells, for instance, in this particular area. So we're going to have to think about redosing. So we're going to have to think about these things, which is another layer of complexity when we think about not only treating these children, but following these children, and then strategies to redose them. So again, we get into that price and value business where we have to think through, how can we do this in an equitable way for all of the people who are going to need and deserve this therapy?
I just want to say, Dr. Reyna, thanks for sharing that managed access program. The Novartis model truly is amazing. I teach it in my classes, and it's always, really quite a pleasure to talk about. And also for sharing about how y'all have systematized this, going and talking to patient advocacy groups about, this is what we're thinking about a trial design. What do you think? What's your feedback? And I think that's obviously something I always encourage biopharmaceutical companies to do. We are at the point where I'm going to start taking questions from the audience. We don't have many yet, so I hope that they filter in. But before we do that, I have one last question for Dr. Krishnamurti. And it's just, as a clinician who's involved in clinical trials, you obviously have experience explaining to the people who participate in these trials that at this point in time, as Pat just said a second ago, redosing is not a possibility, right? And so whereas we hope that you will be able to have a direct benefit from participating in this trial, it's not a guarantee. And moreover, once you participate in the trial, at this point in time, certain other doors are going to be closed to you, whether it comes to participating in other trials or even using an approved product once it comes to market, until we get over that redosing, just sort of technical barrier. So I was just wondering, in terms of, this ongoing question of today of what do we do, to make sure that the widest amount of patients benefit from this research as possible. For those people who did participate in research and now they cannot benefit from anything else because of redosing, what do you think we need to be doing, again, across all stakeholders on this redosing issue?
So fundamentally, the problem comes from our history of the clinical trial being designed by big investigators in big centers in rich countries, and the patient not having a voice in this. And we have been incrementally changing this. And so maybe this is a time to change it even further. So 2 examples. So somebody has a gene therapy and it fails. They're still alive. And their first question is a real question that's happened that a patient has asked me. So what do I do next? I came to you for a cure. And so you don't have an answer for me. So I have brought this up saying, so you have cells that you cultured on this patient, what thought can you give to thinking about methods for a second dose if it were required? And these are systems that you could develop. The other issue is, okay, so somebody has very severe disease and they're going to, so incapacitated, like that metachromatic leukodystrophy patient I said. But what about somebody with sickle cell disease who's had a stroke? Now they're going to get a blood transfusion all their lives, so they're going to get iron overloaded. But the sponsors are thinking, well, I can show an endpoint of reducing pain crises and then going to the FDA and getting this product approved. It's very difficult for me to show an endpoint in prevention of a side effect. And so therefore, every trial does not include people who's had a stroke, and which is sort of a major complication of sickle cell disease. So I keep asking the question, so you get qualification based on pain. What am I going to tell my patient who've had a stroke? And saying, we have gene therapy now, but sorry, we didn't test it in the clinical trial. We can't offer it to you because I can't show it to Medicaid that there was any benefit to it. In fact, even phase 1 studies where it's only safety are not enrolling patients with a stroke, because even if you enroll them in the phase 1 study, you could generate some data that could justify using this in a clinical or even in a research setting.
I'm so glad you brought this up. And I know I've had this direct conversation with Pat Furlong in terms of, Duchenne muscular dystrophy. One of its hallmarks is loss of ambulation, yet individuals who are unable to ambulate typically are not allowed into the clinical trials. And so then when a product comes to market, it's a question of, is a payer going to pay for this product to be used in this person, given that they don't match the trial, the sample of the trial. Pat, do you want to jump in here? And then we're going to go to some of these questions from the audience. And Liza,
Yeah.
I can't tell if your hand is up because you want to talk or if that was just a remnant from before. Pat, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is exactly it. When you have narrow inclusion criteria, whatever that narrow inclusion criteria is, and in rare disease, there's a lot of heterogeneity across. When we're looking at a single endpoint that requires ambulation, it leaves all of these other people out of the equation and often out of the label. So it feels heartbreaking to these people, because it says something also about how we value their life after they lose ambulation, right? We don't have the same interest in belief in that your life has value, so you're outside this equation. And this is why I think trials really have to be inclusive, so that we learn and so that we, at the end of the day, get these broad labels, because otherwise you can't make the case to Medicaid, or you're making the case and it takes so long that you're years down the road before you get an answer from them, and often it's negative. So, I think rare disease is a different beast, and we need to understand the variability that is inherent in rare diseases and the need of these patients who have often nothing or very little to offer. Zolgensma is a classic example of really an incredible therapy, but most of the rare diseases don't have a Zolgensma. And even in gene therapy across the muscular dystrophies, at least, we're not going to see if I can classify this as the Zolgensma effect, where somebody who wasn't going to sit, wasn't going to breathe on their own, wasn't going to be able to feed themselves is suddenly doing that, right? You're not going to see those kinds of dramatic changes, because once skeletal muscle is lost, it's gone, and you can't at this moment replace it. So I feel that this is really detrimental to our community and to the muscular dystrophy communities, where people, like you just mentioned, Dr. Krishnamurti, with stroke, then they're excluded. So one single sort of fact then excludes you out of an opportunity to preserve function and improve the quality of your life. It's devastating for these patients and families.
So we're going to go now to the audience questions. The first one, I invite any of you who want to respond to go ahead, just hit your raise hand and I'll make sure to call on you. This is a question. I am wondering if organizations that focus on rare disease therapy development across multiple diseases could serve as a clearinghouse for redacted safety data. Maybe an organization like, I'm probably going to say this wrong, IRDIRC, because of the need for this clearinghouse to be international in nature. The safety data could be redacted and released periodically to meet the needs of specific communities and also across other gene therapy programs, as was the comment for both Pat and Dr. Johnson. Do the panelists feel this approach would address the concerns they raised? Who wants to take that?
A short answer, yes.
All right, Dr.
Yeah, I
Krishnamurti
think it would
comes
be
in
great
with
to cohort it.
yes.
Yeah,
Sorry, Dr. Johnson, go ahead.
No, I think it's a great idea. I think questions of how to operationalize it so it gets, you know, you don't just put it in a database that no one sort of ever sees, or it's like the genome databases that have limited access. You know, it needs to be sort of provider friendly. You know, potentially your community hematologist has not had any training on gene therapy, so the patient comes to them with questions. Like, however, there needs to be a translator somewhere and, you know, someone in communications who kind of can help explain it so they can, you know, trickle it down to the patients. You know, so if the groups who are interested can't get to it, then what's the point of having it?
Anyone else want to weigh in on this? Oh, Pat, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, ERDIC, as you just mentioned, it would be a very nice clearinghouse. You need a Switzerland, if you will. You need, and very specific rules and regulations about who has access, under what circumstances, and what's the process. And I think that I wish that there would be a demand that you know, all the data goes in there, because when we silo data, people lose out. We silo data is siloed for years and years until there's a publication or a readiness, whatever that means. And then who stands to lose is the patient. So I don't disagree that having a Switzerland, if you will, to have this data and have sharing agreements would be really useful.
Maybe what I can add
Yeah,
is
just
I
a quick-
definitely agree with what has been shared. And this is where we are very, very focused on what I said earlier, right? Keeping track of our own data and keeping track of any possible signal that could imply a risk to our patient population. And that means not only the clinical trial population, but also the real world evidence, right? And so because it's our responsibility to bring this forward immediately to clinicians and to families, so that if they are on gene therapy, that they can be looking out for anything that we could be finding as a signal, right? So reporting signals as quickly as we identify them through the pharmacovigilance that we do with the authorities is key to us. And so we report, first of all, we report yearly, but also keeping track of anything that's happening internally within our own trials and with our registry. So I just want to put that out there, but I totally agree with our panelists.
I wish there was a vehicle for FDA who has all this data, right, to take a look across, because they're the ones that are, at least in the United States, that are responding to all of the 600 or more gene therapy studies. So I think we could learn a great deal from that data if it was, if there were data sharing agreements and obviously rules and regulations put in place when companies get in there, that the data is going to look like this, it's going to be shared in this way, and we're going to learn from it, would be really terrific for and really useful for disease communities.
Thanks, Pat. Liza?
I was going to add a follow-up about perception matters. Something that came up in our focus groups was, are sponsors releasing this because they want to, or because the FDA is making them? I think they feel like, there's this little press release that comes out like, oh, Bluebird, or I forget the recent one that was a neuromuscular disorder, announces clinical hold. And then there's like no more information. It's this information vacuum. And so at least among our sickle cell community, they don't feel that they're getting all the information, that what is being released is not sufficient to meet their needs.
Dr. Reyna, I have a question from the audience for you. What allows Novartis to interface with patient groups and respond to their suggestions so well? Are there certain skill sets or resources that would help other companies follow your model?
Oh, that's a great question. And I'm very passionate about it because I was right there with them from the very beginning. So one of the largest patient advocate groups, which is QSMA, it's been in place over 30 years. And so what allows us to really communicate with them directly is really the trust, right, that we built with them from the very beginning. And so my recommendation is, first of all, who are your key opinion leaders, right? You make that a bridge with them. And then you access also who are the patient advocate groups within your disease area that you can speak to. And once you do, what we did is we just went directly and we said, this is who we are, this is what we're working on, and we would love to have your input. And then we've maintained our communications with them. So we have monthly meetings with, especially with the US Patient Advocate Group, where we have initiatives that we're working on together. We have collaborated with them. They have an industry collaboration that they have very, very unique initiatives that they have designed and have asked for industry collaboration. So we are part of that. So I think keeping those communications open and making that bridge from the very beginning, as soon as you know you're going to be working on a program, on a disease area, your first target should always be your community groups such as patient advocate groups. And don't underestimate anyone, right? Everybody, it counts. Everybody's voice is important. And parents' voices are critical to anything that you want to do with any program that you want to launch.
I wonder if Dr. Krishnamurti or Ms. Furlong have thoughts on how to expand that internationally, since we want to make sure we're not just listening to domestic patient groups.
Yeah, so I must say that it is complicated. So on the one hand, I actually thought that after the two patients who got cancer, the sponsor did a pretty good job of getting the word out. And being on the Medical and Research Advisory Committee of the Sickle Cell Disease Association of America, I felt that the community-based organizations were very much part and parcel of it. But I think that, your findings, Dr. Liza, are very intriguing, because clearly, it's not trickling down even domestically where it needs to get. So the challenges of a communication are huge and ongoing, and whether it's domestic or within micro communities within our country. There are a lot of people internationally who are trying to find out about gene therapy, and most of it is they're getting on the internet, finding out something that they know that they can never get in their lifetime, probably. So before it's actually going to make a lot of sense to be educating people, we have to find ways to be able to get it there. But otherwise, it's the same mechanisms. And then in many parts of the world, people do a better job of organizing community-based organizations that we do in the United States for certain diseases. Sickle cell, could be one of them. Where in other places, people have had governments to support them. And yet in parts of Africa, the government hasn't supported sickle cell as much. It's very different depending on which country you go to and what is available and where they are. But it's the same thing, is you go to people with honesty in your heart and truth on your tongue. And that's basically it.
I love that, Lakshmanan. Pat, anything, or shall we move on to the next
Sure,
question?
no, I think what you're right, in terms of the United States, we have a community advisory board and certainly interact with pharmaceutical companies on a continuous basis. We also have a drug development roundtable by which companies will come to us and we look at things and issues in the preclinical space. In addition to that, with our international organization, we've developed a community advisory board that's representative of Eastern Western Europe, Israel, and several other countries. And we have regular meetings with pharmaceutical companies to discuss their protocol, to discuss their plans for an extended access program or compassionate use programs, or basically, how are you going to think about equity in this, not only in the clinical trials process, but once you're approved. So I think there's various systems and processes that you can put in place that help. But you're right, communication is always an issue, and it's people that are not connected through social media or live in rural areas, or for that matter, intimidated by medicine or have cultural or religious issues, that the communication still is incredibly difficult for them. And you really have to think through what are the best ways to reach out.
I'm going to throw this one up for the panel. What types of support could be offered to industry for the cost of, oops, my thing just reset, I lost it, research and development in order to make the ultimate cost to individual patients more affordable? This person says, it seems to me an ethical issue of the benefit to a trial participant to receive a treatment that they might not be able to afford once the therapy is approved makes the inability to enter a trial an issue of justice. Anyone have thoughts on what types of support could be offered to industry to reduce the cost to individual patients?
The COVID vaccine is a great example of the government's, supporting or not the individual costs. But I think that ultimately business has to find a way of making this product at an affordable cost to compete with others in the market who are not able to do that.
In one of my other projects, we were supposed to have a webinar yesterday, which got thwarted due to technical difficulties, but is going to be rescheduled, that basically is looking at this idea of, can you pick up warp speed model that we used for COVID-19 and apply it to other things, whether it's rare diseases, whether it's common diseases, whether it's non-pandemic diseases. So I think what you just said is something that a lot of people are thinking about right now about, can we apply that model? If so, or if not, bits, pieces, why, et cetera. Anyone else have any thoughts on this question?
The nanoparticles that we use in the COVID vaccine could be used for gene therapy. Who would have thought, to be lipid nanoparticle that we're injecting into people?
I do think we have to think of innovative ways to be able to support industry, to be able to support patients in participation of studies. One of the things that we've sort of tossed around a little bit is, could we as advocacy organizations provide additional support to a clinical trial so that patients who had significant challenges of participation could be financially supported to do just that? Again, advocacy organizations have to decide where their priorities are. But at the end of the day, I think all stakeholders need to figure out how can we best support patients so that this is equitable and so that patients and families are able to not only participate in trials, but have access to these therapies that will hopefully protect and preserve some of the quality of their life, or for that matter, like Zolgensma, just change the quality dramatically. So I really feel like we have to think out of the box and look at that. In terms of the vaccines, we couldn't get to every country. Certainly in Africa, they got to the cities, but getting in rural areas was difficult. So they had to really think out of the box. This is a time when all stakeholders need to come together and figure out how we can do this better, more equitable, and with more justice for everyone concerned.
Liza?
Yeah, I'm going to make a comment that's third rail and just leave it. But I think, there may be an examination of industry profits, right? I think some people are re-examining, the record profits of things like Amazon or other things, and then what workers are paid. So looking at sort of the books in some way to see if it seems fair. I think, as I mentioned already, getting people at the table early to think about how we reduce costs. And then 3, this is also a little bit, maybe liberal leaning, but, FMLA is clearly not enough in this country, right? There's the economic hardships of chronic illness. And so it doesn't do you any good to have leave if it's unpaid. So you can even think of it in the oncology spectrum. A kid gets leukemia, their parent has to spend all this time in the hospital with their child while they're undergoing a bone marrow transplant, let's say. Well, they're missing work, and if they have a job, you can't work from home, then that's lost wages, and they still have to pay their car payment. They still have to pay sort of rent. So sort of thinking of a way to support patients who are going through these intensive therapies in a better way. And I don't know where that money comes from, but it's would benefit a lot of people, not just the rare diseases.
I totally agree with you, Liza. I think that there is such a vast difference between the people who are at the top of companies and the people who are the worker bees. And that in and of itself creates such an inequity about what you can get done. And I think the vaccine has brought that there. This is an unfair system with certain people having access and others not at all.
So I've got one last question for all panelists, and I'll start with Dr. Reyna. So if you were at a global forum of sponsors, clinicians, advocacy groups, legislatures, you name it, whatever stakeholder groups you want to imagine, but they're devoted to your disease of interest, be that SMA or Duchenne or sickle cell, what one point would you feel most passionately that, you know, if I say nothing else, I need to say this one thing to this group about how to take care of the wider patient group, not just the patients who are fortuitous enough to be in a clinical trial?
Wow, that's an amazing and fun question, because I think it will bring what we're really all about, you know, to the front, right? And what I would say is I would emphasize the need for a continued focus on patients and the community we serve. None of our clinical studies would be possible without the deep commitment and partnership from community members. It is our duty to keep all potential patients in mind as we advance scientific understanding of gene therapy, and we all have the role to play, you know, we all have a really big role to play in this. I feel grateful to work for an organization that knows that there is a key element that affect the, you know, patient's journey, like, for example, newborn screening, right? Implementation in getting all states in the United States screening for SMA. And then working collaboratively to advance them, because once it's okay to push for newborn screening, but what kind of support would the state need to push it forward? So for instance, you know, we are partnering in the US very closely with organizations like I said earlier, Cure SMA, which is the leading organization here in the US, and many others, right? So not only do we work with the US patient advocate groups, we also work with all ex-US you know, patient advocate groups. And our goal is to continue to bring forward any possibility of identifying those patients early. So for example, in Europe, Novartis partners with SMA Europe, which is the other patient advocate group. And what we do is we certainly are helping them launch the European Alliance for Newborn Screening for Spinal Muscular Atrophy. And in doing so, with the goal to include all, you know, SMA and all national newborn screening programs by 2025. So I think my push would be for early identification of these babies and to keep our communities in mind. And exactly what Pat has been stressing on is what are their needs? What can we do to support them once they're part of a trial? It's our responsibility to make sure that we keep them, you know, safe, right? And that we also keep them within the trial with anything that may come up as they participate in the trial. Life happens, and these families have a child affected with a rare disease, which means things can go wrong in any minute, right? Just because they're participating in a trial doesn't make them safe. It means that we have an even higher responsibility for this family. So that's what I would push for, is to keep our families up front and center.
Yeah, I was just wondering how many people on this call here in the United States have any idea if their state, you know, provides or mandates newborn SMA screening. And it looks like Kara just read my mind and jumped and put that in the chat. So if you're in the United States, you might want to check that out. Dr. Krishnamurti, yes. What would you say to this august group of diverse stakeholders?
Say that improving access, improving education, improving communication, giving the patient a voice is important in every field, that we're not just this field. But if we're going to do one thing, I would say reduce, knock off 2 zeros from the cost. If you can reduce the cost by 2 logs, you'll increase the number of patients who are getting it by 2 logs. So,
right.
and everything else will work itself out from all the other efforts that people are doing.
Thank you. Dr. Johnson?
So, you know, 2 kind of statistics. We have an ongoing survey of parents and children with sickle cell disease, and it's something like 89% of them greatly trust their healthcare provider, right? So this is in our hematology clinic. Many of them have been coming since birth. And that's from the Validated Healthcare, Trust in Healthcare Professionals questionnaire. We're also administering the Trust in Medical Research questionnaire. Only 28% of those same respondents trust doctors who do medical research. And so I think that there's a lot of stigma that still exists in healthcare. You know, if you're lower socioeconomic status or an underrepresented minority are probably the 2 groups that commonly, you know, have a difficulty interfacing. So I think we need to think about how we build trust, because if people don't trust the new products, they're not going to enroll in the clinical trial, and then we're not, or, you know, if they get approved because we get enough people to enroll, they're not going to run enthusiastically, even if they can have it covered, just because of the trust issue.
And I want to know we're at time, but Pat, we have to hear from you. What one thing would you say that we need to keep in mind in thinking about patients other than those in the trials?
I think that we need to really have a plan for a compassionate use program for those people who would have to be fighting years and years in terms of getting Medicaid. And I think the trials have to be inclusive, not just of little boys that are 4 to 7, but we have to be inclusive of the population that we're serving. Otherwise, we're not serving them well.
Okay, well, with that, we are out of time. I'd like to thank our panelists for what I said. It was going to be a wide-ranging, great conversation, and I think I was proven correct. And I want to thank our attendees for their thoughtful questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. On behalf of PGTME, I would like to thank all who have participated in, attended, or helped put this event and the events of this entire week together, including Kara Hunt and John Mazzarelli and Lisa Kearns, all of whom have been active behind the scenes, making sure that this worked. So this concludes the second annual PGTME Lunchtime Lecture Series. We hope that you come back and see us next year. In the meantime, these videos are going to be on the internet. Just give us a week or so to clean them up and caption them, and then they're going to be up on YouTube. So just search PGTME on YouTube and you will find it. And with that, have a great day and we'll see you next year.
Thank you.
Thank you.